So, Mr. Peck, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us, and especially for this film. What, first of all, was it that attracted you to the project? Was it Alex Gibney's presence, or was it a more personal relationship that you had with George Orwell and his works?
Well, in fact, it came in as a big, huge gift from Universal, who approached Alex Gibney to inquire if he would be producing such a film around Orwell. And Alex called me, and I asked him if I would have basically the freedom to do the film I want, and he assured me that yes, that was the case. And of course I say yes, because that's not something you get every day, to have access to the totality of such an author body of work, and Orwell being that recognized figure in the whole world, to become an adjective. So that's not, an offer that you can refuse.
The very concept of objective truth is fading out of this world.
I'm going to set down what I dare not say aloud to anyone.
And what was it about Orwell and going through these archives that made you, I don't know, anything that touched you personally? Because, I imagine because you fled Haiti at a very young age, you were familiar with the language of totalitarianism.
Well, not only that, I grew up with what we call newspeak, the use of language in order to hide your real intention. That's an approach that you have in economy, in business, in all sort of part of life. And I grew up, indeed, coming from Haiti. You recognize very early on that words could have two meanings. When some government are talking about democracy, and everywhere else, and then in your country, they are supporting the dictatorship. That I learned very early on. The Duvalier dictatorship, who stayed more than 35 years, it was only with the support of the USA and part of European government. So on one side, you're talking about democracy. On the other side, you're making deals with government or authoritarian regime who are, keeping their people down. So that contradiction, I was aware of it very early on in my life.
I was wondering, because there's a quote that stood out for me in the film. It's when Orwell talks about Animal Farm, and he says that it's the first time that he fuses his political intent with his artistic intent. And I have to admit, when I heard that quote, I thought, this sounds a lot like what your approach to filmmaking could be. Is that the case?
Well, it is. When I started in cinema, even before, it was like you couldn't mix any political ambition with art. Art was supposed to be something special, something pure. The same thing with entertainment. Everything became entertainment. Even news became entertainment. So, but I never believed that it's not because it's entertainment that you can't put, more weight in terms of the content. And you will find a form to make it, cinema in my case. And I always believed that for me, filmmaking is a political, I would say, I had always a political intention in making my films. So, and I was glad that it was also Orwell's intention from the start, because, what he basically says is that, the attitude to say, well, I am neutral or I don't take position is actually a political position. There is not such a saying that, I don't have an opinion or I can't act about what is happening in the place I live. No, it's you're a citizen. Democracy means that you are an informed and educated citizen that takes part in the affair of your city or the society.
The words democracy, freedom, justice have each of them several different meanings. which cannot be reconciled with one another. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful.
The love in the air, I've never seen anything like it.
And murder respectable.
Now we see how rapidly the degradation of democracy could happen, even in the most important beacon of democracy that the United States was, and it's not anymore. So I always believe in the value of fighting for freedom of speech, freedom to be able to vote. It's a luxury in most part of the world, but here in Europe we live it as it's perfectly natural, and it will grow by itself, and you have to do nothing to defend it. No, you have to work on it every day.
One thing that and you mentioned, it is only Orwell that speaks, and one thing that I really much enjoyed about the documentary was how personal it was. And I found the beginning and the end rather eerie, because it's that photo of a baby Orwell with his Indian nanny, but it's also the de Kock bacteria, which just it lends the beginning of the film specifically a quite haunting sort of atmosphere. Can you tell me more about that choice?
Yes, it's one of the many layers that you have to find to make the film also emotionally, close to you. I don't think I would like to make a film that is essentially intellectual. It's about cinema. Cinema is about emotion. And it's one of the tools that I use. I use everything: music, images, graphic, to make sure that you are not only in the presence of just thoughts, but also of emotion, of thinking, of exchanges, of a collective community. It's much more than politics. It's also life itself. When you use the subject of I can't breathe, the analogy with actually people who can't breathe in their society because they just not accepted, or they not considered like normal human being. So all those layers give in its totality a really strong emotional bound to what is said in the content itself.
Obviously, we see Trump, we see Putin, but one thing to show its breadth, we also see an enormous amount of European leaders. We see Meloni, we see Viktor Orban,
Bush
as well, and also Eric Zemmour at one point as well. How do you, in your opinion, view Europe's reaction to the rise of totalitarianism compared to the US, for example?
Well, that's the thing. Europeans sometimes it's always bad to say European as if there is one unity. But in most countries, you can see that there is still a denial. There is a denial that can never happen here. But we forgot how many years of Berlusconi that we had. It's a typical other example of how it can happen in Europe. So people make fun of Donald Trump, but I don't see, I just see it as an exaggeration of behavior that I've seen in Europe. The same kind of, use of language to destroy people is being used. It's just a little bit more polite, a little bit more intellectual sometimes, with more general culture, But the words mean what they mean. So, and you could see a lot of things that happened in the US. At some point, 5 or 10 years later, they happen in Europe.
Yeah.
That have been my experience. So it's the same thing with I Am Not Your Negro. I remember the first discussion I had in France and some other European. They would say, wow, the bad American, they are so racist. And as if, there is no racism in Europe, And so the denial is sometimes very deep because it's hard to face reality. It's hard to hear what other people are telling you, even though you are living side by side with them. And by the way, that's why I did then exterminate all the brutes.
Right.
You know, I went to the bottom of that story and showed that it's linked in European history, and that was transported. That same racism was transported in the United States. They didn't start it. Europe started. And it was important when you lose your connection with history. And that's one of the problems. The ignorance is really incredible, even though we had the facilities and the instrument to gather world, history, basically.
Do you begin to see then what kind of world we are creating?
What struck me the first time I saw the film was also the audience reaction. And when there's newspeak, when you give the definitions and what they actually mean, like the audience, I could hear very uncomfortable laughter. And I was actually very surprised because at one point, especially for Anti-Semitism 2024, there was applause. There was it felt like this very cathartic almost moment in the audience where people needed to see that on screen. Was it important to include that one?
Well, I was surprised myself about the response that was overwhelming in that audience. And I had, one particular good friend of mine who is from a Jewish religion, even though she's not a follower. She interpreted differently, and I can understand why. But I understood that the reaction was the fact that many people felt that they were not able to criticize a right-wing government basically making a genocide in Gaza. That was the response I felt. Because each time you touch the subject, you're immediately accused of anti-Semitism. But I know that if you want to attack me on that, just watch all my film. I'm probably one of the people who work a lot on the Shoah and on genocide, and not only in Germany but everywhere. Yeah. So I can make the distinction between the use of a word and the propaganda that it's used for. Yeah. And if I have to say that Netanyahu should be in prison, I will say it. And that's the reality. His own justice system have been trying to arrest him for many years. Yeah. And the war is also a result of that, because he doesn't want to go to jail. So if you cannot say those words, this is called, there is no freedom of speech. There is no democracy. Yeah. If you can't even talk about this publicly.
And very, very lastly, you towards the end of the film, there's one segment that stuck with me, which was Edward Snowden. Because I remember at the time Citizen 4 came out, I remember interviewing Laura Poitras, and it was all over the news. And he says at one point that his greatest fear is that nothing will change. And sadly, he has been proven right to a certain degree. Do you share that same fear?
Absolutely, and it's heartbreaking because I see this young man in his 20s who sacrificed everything to tell us the truth, and now he's somewhere in exile in the Soviet Union, in Russia. He took the risk to tell us what was going on, and what he saw was absolutely a nightmare, and that nightmare is already there. We lost that war long time ago, and now those potentially dangerous tools are in the hands of people who don't care but about themselves. They're not looking forward, and they don't care what happened to America and the rest of the world after that. And they think they can get away with it. They won't get away with it. That's the sheer reality. And I hope that Americans will not accept that their election will be taken away from them. That's my whole hope, even though that have been seen in other countries.
On that note, Mr. Peck, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.